There's a specific moment in every empath's life that arrives with almost haunting quiet. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with shouting, sobbing, or even a visible shift. It slips in softly, so softly, that even the empath might not realize what's happening at first. You could be deep in a conversation, perhaps with someone you've known and cherished for years. Maybe it's a partner, a family member, a lifelong friend. You've poured your energy, your patience, your heart into this connection. And then they say something, or fail to say what matters, or do something that doesn't seem monumental, but it is. Because in that moment, you feel it. A door inside you, one that's always been open, slowly shuts. Not with a bang, not with bitterness, just a subtle, final click. And here's what's truly chilling. You don't feel heartbreak, rage, or sadness. You feel stillness, an eerie, steady calm. A calm so profound that it feels like it's coming from a place deeper than thought, deeper than emotion. And in that instant, you know something critical has changed. Not on the surface, not something you can just talk out or fix with time. Something in your core has rearranged itself. The part of you that once remained open, generous, hopeful, has closed. Not to everyone, but to this person, in this relationship, in this dynamic. Your heart has sealed itself off permanently. Carl Jung, the famed Swiss psychiatrist, spent years studying this phenomenon. He didn't see it as mere emotional fatigue or temporary detachment. He saw it as something much more powerful, what he named the point of no return. This wasn't just an emotional withdrawal. It was, as he defined it, a complete restructuring of the psyche, an irreversible transformation that altered how one relates to another human being. Jung believed that once this line is crossed, no apology, no act of change, no amount of waiting can undo the closure. And that's exactly what we're going to explore together today. We'll unpack what this moment actually is, how you know when you're nearing it, what Jung discovered happens afterward, and most importantly, why it might just be the psyche's greatest act of self-preservation. Let's begin with understanding Jung himself. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in Switzerland, and he changed the way we think about the human mind. His theories on individuation, psychological types, and the collective unconscious laid the foundation for what would become a profound and human-centered psychology. But one area of Jung's work that remains particularly overlooked, yet deeply relevant to empaths, his study of people with an extraordinary capacity for emotional attunement, those we would now call empaths. He observed that these individuals didn't just understand others intellectually, they felt them, often deeply and instinctively. Their internal compass was driven by emotional resonance, by an almost involuntary sense of connection to those around them. Jung noticed that these people carried what he termed radical openness, an open channel in their emotional structure that allowed them to absorb others' energy, pain, and needs. This openness was both their greatest strength and, tragically, their deepest vulnerability. Now think about your own experience, if you identify as an empath. How many times have you stepped into someone's suffering without hesitation? How often have you absorbed the emotions of those around you, sometimes even before they themselves understood what they were feeling? This capacity to feel deeply isn't something you trained for. It wasn't a skill set developed through effort. As Jung described, it's simply your natural psychological orientation. You are tuned to others like a finely calibrated instrument, vibrating with every emotional frequency around you. And yet, as Jung warned, this openness is not sustainable in the long term unless it is honored, respected, and, most crucially, reciprocated. When it isn't, the empathic heart doesn't merely hurt, it reaches a crisis point. For a long time, empaths endure. They keep the heart open even in the face of disregard, misunderstanding, even emotional harm. They rationalize, they hope, they explain and re-explain. They forgive over and over, convinced that love and patience will eventually bridge the gap. But according to Jung, there comes a moment, a limit, when the psyche itself says, enough. This is not an act of revenge. It's not a dramatic explosion of resentment. It is instead what Jung called psychic self-preservation through boundary formation. The heart doesn't slam shut in rage. It closes like a flower at night, slowly but permanently, to protect the inner life from further damage. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung recounts the case of a woman in her 40s who had spent decades emotionally supporting a husband who rarely, if ever, offered her the same consideration. She had carried the emotional weight of the marriage, adjusting to his moods, prioritizing his needs, hoping that one day he'd see her fully. But during what seemed like just another mundane argument, she felt something irreversible happen. She described it to Jung as like a light going off, a sensation that a door she never knew existed simply closed inside her. From that moment, her feelings were gone. Not numbed, not buried, gone. She didn't feel angry. She didn't want revenge. She didn't even want change anymore. She just didn't feel anything toward him. That, Jung said, was the hallmark of the point of no return. This wasn't a choice she made. It wasn't a tactic. It was an act from deep within the Psychean act taken not by the conscious mind, but by the self, Jung's term for the organizing principle of the whole personality. The self had intervened because continued openness had become a threat to psychological survival. This is where popular psychology often misses the mark. We're told that closure or detachment should always be conscious, deliberate, rational. But Jung understood that the psyche has its own intelligence. When the conscious ego refuses to set limits, when it clings to hope even in damaging situations, the self will take over. It will shut the door, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Jung emphasized that this kind of closure doesn't come from the ego's decision. It bypasses logic, willpower, or desire. It arises from a deeper place, like the body instinctively clotting a wound. It protects not your comfort, but your wholeness. And once this psychic mechanism activates, the transformation begins. But before we explore what happens after the closing, it's vital to recognize the signs that you're approaching it. Jung identified several psychological indicators that the self is preparing to close the heart. The first is what he called the exhaustion of hope. This isn't the same as pessimism or even sadness. It's a very specific kind of depletion, the kind that says, I don't have the energy to believe anymore. For empaths, hope often fuels their emotional resilience. They continue to give, to explain, to wait because they hold on to the belief that things will improve. But hope is not infinite. Jung observed that when the reservoir of hope runs dry, not from bitterness but from sheer fatigue, the closure process begins. Imagine being in a relationship where you've poured everything into making it work. You've expressed your needs countless times, offered every ounce of empathy you possess, made space again and again. And then one day, someone asks you to explain yourself one more time and you just can't. Not out of anger, not as a silent protest. You simply cannot summon the will. That is the psyche's warning bell. It's telling you, this is no longer sustainable. Jung understood that emotional energy, like any other resource, must be managed. And when it's been exhausted beyond a certain point, the psyche conserves what's left by shutting down unnecessary output. Hope, in that context, becomes a threat. Continuing to hope places the self at risk. The second sign Jung named is clarity without emotion. Suddenly, you see everything clearly. The patterns, the manipulation, the repeated harm. But unlike before, you're not overwhelmed by it. You're not panicking. You're not even angry. You're eerily calm. You might even find yourself speaking about the most painful truths with total emotional neutrality. Jung called this the dissociation of insight from feeling, and he saw it not as coldness, but as mercy. The psyche, he believed, is being compassionate. It's allowing you to see the truth without being emotionally devastated by it. This is a moment of stunning lucidity, not because your feelings are gone forever, but because they've been placed on pause while your deeper structures shift. You're being protected as your internal world reorganizes itself around a new, more honest reality. And here's the crucial insight. This clarity is not you becoming hard or numb. It's not a sign you've lost your empathy. Jung insisted that the empathic heart doesn't disappear. It simply gets quarantined away from the source of harm. You still have that deep well of feeling, but the connection to this person, this situation, has been deliberately severed. That capacity for empathy is no longer accessible in this context, not out of cruelty, but to prevent further psychological injury. The third and final warning Jung described before the permanent closure is the cessation of the explaining impulse. Empaths are natural explainers. It's part of their emotional wiring. They explain their thoughts, their needs, their boundaries, not to manipulate, but to build bridges, to create understanding, to bring connection. They do it patiently, often repeatedly, even when their words fall on deaf ears. But when the heart begins to close, something shifts. The compulsion to explain simply stops. This isn't passive aggression. It's not silence as punishment. It's the quiet resignation that explanation no longer serves a purpose. You've said everything there is to say. You've clarified, contextualized, and rephrased 100 different ways. But nothing has changed. And eventually, the psyche recognizes this as a closed loop, a cycle that only drains energy without return. So it withdraws from the loop entirely. Imagine someone asking you, "What's wrong?" And for the first time, instead of answering, you respond with, "Nothing," or "Never mind." Not because you're holding back, but because you genuinely know it wouldn't matter. This is a powerful psychological shift. It marks the final stage before the closure. And Jung believed that if there's any hope left to salvage the relationship, it must be acted on before this stage sets in. Because after this, there may be no way back. Now let's talk about the actual moment of severance, the point of no return itself. According to Jung, this isn't merely an emotional cutoff. It is a structural transformation inside the psyche. He described it as the moment where the libidinal investment, the psychic energy you've been pouring into another person, is withdrawn at the root. The connection doesn't just pause, it's dissolved. It vanishes like a cord that has been clipped clean. Before the closure, energy was flowing, attention, emotion, care, presence. Afterward, it's as if the current goes dead. You're not choosing to withhold. You simply no longer have access to the emotional charge that once existed. The person is still there physically, but psychologically, they've faded into the background of your inner world. What makes this moment so unsettling, Jung noted, is how ordinary it often is. His patients described the closure happening while driving, folding laundry, eating breakfast. The trigger wasn't always dramatic. In fact, it was often small, what Jung called the final straw. But it wasn't the size of the event that mattered. It was the cumulative weight of every similar moment that had come before. Take, for instance, the man Jung wrote about in The Development of Personality. He'd spent his life trying to connect with his emotionally distant father. He tried being obedient, rebellious, successful, vulnerable, every strategy he could muster. And one day, his father made a dismissive comment. It wasn't overtly cruel, it wasn't even unusual, but something in that moment snapped. The son felt a door close in his chest, and he described it as hearing a lock click. From then on, he could speak to his father, even be around him, but the longing for connection had vanished. Not because he chose to let it go, but because the self had decided that holding on to hope was no longer safe. What follows this moment, Jung observed, is not just emotional quiet, but a full restructuring of the inner world. The personality doesn't simply go on as before, minus one person. It adapts. It reorganizes itself to accommodate the closure. The self begins to reclaim the energy that had been tied up in the relationship, and with that reclamation comes clarity, discernment, and sometimes a disorienting sense of foreignness. You may feel like you're watching yourself from the outside, how composed you are, how little guilt you feel, how easily you say no where you once struggled to speak at all. This is not indifference. This is the self doing what the ego could not, drawing a boundary in permanent ink. Jung identified three key elements of this reorganization. First, there's the withdrawal of projection. Before the heart closes, we often project our hopes, ideals, or fantasies onto the other person. We see who they could be, not who they are. We fill in their silences with kindness. We interpret their neglect as struggle. We imagine their potential and hold tight to it, often in the absence of evidence. But after the closure, that projection collapses. You see the person as they are, not cruel necessarily, but limited, unwilling, incapable of the kind of emotional reciprocity you longed for. This can be startling, even painful, because the person you thought you were loving might never have truly existed, except in your projection. The second shift is what Jung called the activation of discernment. When the heart is open, empaths often see through the lens of emotional possibility. But after the closure, that filter is gone. You begin to notice patterns that had always been there but were once obscured. You see the manipulation, the lack of curiosity about your inner world, the ways your emotional labor was never met in kind. This is not cynicism, it's clarity, and Jung believed it was essential for healing. Then comes the third shift, which often takes empaths by surprise: the absence of guilt. For people who spent their lives giving, explaining, forgiving, it can be jarring to no longer feel guilty about pulling back. But Jung was adamant. This absence of guilt isn't a sign of cruelty. It's a sign that the self has reclaimed sovereignty. The guilt that once kept you tethered to one-sided relationships dissolves because the emotional economy of that relationship is no longer active. You're no longer responsible for maintaining the connection, for fixing what never should have been yours to fix. You may notice you can now disappoint this person without emotional collapse. You can say no and not spiral. You can witness their distress, maybe even their attempts to guilt you, and feel nothing. Not spite, not superiority, just neutrality. It's not that you wish them harm. It's simply that their emotional reality is no longer inside your field. But even with this newfound calm, Jung warned that grief is inevitable. Not necessarily for the person you've closed your heart to, but for the version of the relationship you hoped to have. For the dream that kept you giving, waiting, explaining. This is what Jung called the grief of disillusionment, a particularly haunting kind of sorrow because you're mourning not just someone else, but a part of yourself. The part that believed, the part that hoped against all odds, the part that thought if you could just love enough, things would finally shift. And here's what makes this grief so complex. The other person may still be in your life. You may still live with them, still share space, still see them regularly. But something in you knows the connection is over. Not practically, but psychologically. Jung referred to this as living with the ghost of a relationship. It's a strange and painful state where everything looks the same on the outside, but inside, you know something has died. Worse yet, others may not understand. From the outside, your behavior might appear cold, distant, even cruel. They might say you're overreacting, that you're holding a grudge, that you should forgive, soften, try again. But they don't see the years, maybe decades of invisible effort that preceded this closure. They don't understand that this wasn't a conscious decision, it was a psychic necessity. And when they pressure you to reopen the door, they're unknowingly asking you to commit a betrayal against your own psyche. Jung called this pressure a doubling of the trauma. First, there's the trauma of staying open in a harmful dynamic. Then there's the trauma of being misunderstood or judged for finally closing. His advice? Honor the closure, even when others don't understand. He warned that forcing yourself to act as if your heart is still open just to avoid social discomfort is a form of inner violence. In The Undiscovered Self, he wrote that behaving as if you haven't reached the point of no return, when you clearly have, is a kind of soul-level self-betrayal. And the psyche, he said, does not forgive that kind of betrayal. This is why Jung viewed the closing of the heart not as a failure of empathy, but as its maturation. When your empathy evolves, it becomes selective. It learns discernment. It stops flowing endlessly into people or dynamics that only drain and distort it. The heart that once stayed open for everyone starts to recognize that not everyone is safe to love. Not everyone deserves your endless understanding. This is what Jung considered a sacred transformation, the beginning of true individuation. And while painful, he believed it was a necessary rite of passage in becoming your authentic self. Jung believed that when the heart closes in this way, it doesn't just protect you, it liberates you. It opens the door to a deeper kind of selfhood, one not defined by self-sacrifice, but by self-possession. He described this transition as a return of the self to the self, a psychological homecoming. The energy that was once poured endlessly into trying to fix, maintain, or redeem a broken dynamic becomes available again. But this time, it turns inward. It nourishes your own growth, your creativity, your aliveness. One of the metaphors Jung often used was that of pruning a tree. You don't cut off dead branches out of spite. You do it because the living branches need room to thrive. Similarly, the heart closes not to be cruel, but to protect what is still growing within you. And this energy, once redirected, becomes a force of tremendous vitality. Many of Jung's patients, after their heart had closed and the grief had been honored, reported feeling more alive than they had in years. Their preferences became clearer, their boundaries more intuitive. Their relationships, when they did form, were stronger, more mutual, more rooted in reality. They stopped chasing connection and started recognizing where connection actually existed. This, Jung said, was the gift on the other side of the closure. Not just relief from pain, but the capacity for deeper, more reciprocal intimacy. But Jung also cautioned against one particular pitfall: false closure. This happens when someone declares that their heart has closed, but continues to engage with the person or dynamic in the same way, still explaining, still hoping, still trying. Jung believed this state was actually more damaging than staying open, because it confused both parties and delayed healing. In The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, he wrote, "You cannot close your heart halfway. Either it is closed or it is not." The half-closed heart is a heart in torment. That torment comes from being split. You're no longer fully open, so you can't give freely. But you're not fully closed, so you can't protect yourself either. You're caught in between, a psychological no man's land where clarity is impossible and suffering becomes chronic. Jung's advice? Choose fully. If you are open, be open with clear boundaries. If you are closed, honor the closure with full commitment. But don't torture yourself with indecision. Now let's explore what life looks like after the closure has been fully integrated. After the mourning has passed, the projections have withdrawn, and the energy has returned. Jung found that many of his patients went through a phase of disorientation at first. They expected to feel what they used to feel, and when those feelings didn't return, it was unsettling. But this, he said, was just the psyche adapting to a new internal map. During this adaptation phase, Jung observed a curious phenomenon: the testing period. This is when the other person, sensing something fundamental has shifted, intensifies their efforts to reestablish the old dynamic. They might suddenly become more attentive, apologetic, or emotionally expressive. Some even create crises, not always consciously, as a way to pull you back into emotional entanglement. But Jung warned that this phase is critical. If you respond by reopening the door, not because you want to, but because you feel pressure or guilt, you undermine the very closure that protected you. Worse, you teach the other person that your boundaries are flexible, that your warnings were not serious. This sets the stage for an even more damaging cycle, one where your psyche knows you need protection, but your actions don't follow through. Jung emphasized that boundaries must have teeth. If you say your heart is closed but behave as though it's still open, you confuse not only the other person but your own psyche. This cognitive and emotional dissonance can lead to what Jung described as splitting of the self, where your inner and outer realities become misaligned. It's a high cost to pay for avoiding short-term discomfort. Interestingly, once the heart is safely closed and the boundary is in place, another feeling begins to surface: anger. And while this may seem counterintuitive, Jung believed it was a healthy and necessary stage. When your heart was open, it may have been too dangerous to fully feel your anger. The vulnerability of still caring made the anger feel destabilizing, maybe even frightening. But after closure, you're safe. And so the anger comes forward, not to destroy, but to affirm. It reminds you of what you endured. It reinforces the necessity of the closure. Jung compared this to the body finally allowing inflammation to rise after a deep wound has been sealed. The swelling isn't a setback, it's part of the healing. Anger, in this context, isn't about vengeance. It's about clarity. It's the psyche saying, "What happened to me mattered. It hurt, and I will not forget." But the final stage Jung described is perhaps the most beautiful: the redirection of the libido toward life-giving connections. The energy that once kept you trapped in a hopeless dynamic is now free, and it seeks new paths, paths of joy, purpose, intimacy. You may notice yourself becoming more emotionally present in relationships that do nourish you. You may find creativity returning or passions you'd long set aside. You may even feel a kind of rebirth, like a part of you has been restored. This isn't just a return to who you were before. It's an emergence into who you're becoming, a version of yourself that understands your value, that honors your energy, that no longer negotiates your soul for closeness. Jung called this process the flourishing of the authentic personality, and he believed it was one of the most sacred outcomes of crossing the point of no return. At this point in the journey, the empath doesn't stop being empathic. They simply become wiser about where and how they extend that gift. They stop throwing their emotional resources into black holes. They start investing in places where energy circulates back. Jung saw this as the beginning of a more mature form of love, one that's rooted not in self-abandonment, but in self-respect. But even with all this growth, one lingering question often haunts the empath. What if the other person finally changes after the closure? What if they start doing the very things you begged for, offering the care, empathy, or accountability that you waited years to receive? Jung faced this question often in his clinical work, and his answer was compassionate but unwavering. He said that yes, sometimes people do change. Sometimes they finally get it. But if their change comes after you've crossed the point of no return, it changes nothing about your closure. Jung used the metaphor of a person bringing water to someone who has already died of thirst. The water is real, he wrote. It is wet. It would have saved you. But it came too late. Your heart didn't close out of impatience. It closed because your psyche, after years or decades of data, made a permanent decision. This dynamic is no longer survivable. And even if the other person now becomes everything you once hoped for, that doesn't erase what happened, or, more importantly, what didn't happen when it was most needed. This doesn't mean you can never speak to them again. Jung acknowledged that sometimes a new kind of relationship can form post-closure, but it will be fundamentally different. It will not be based on the old hope or emotional openness. It will be based on clear boundaries and realistic expectations. The old relationship is over. What might emerge is something entirely new, if you even want it. In this new dynamic, the heart remains closed, not out of resentment, but out of wisdom. The closure is not undone, it simply becomes a foundation upon which a more honest connection might be built. Think of it like a bone that's healed after a fracture. It may become strong again, it may even support weight, but it is never the same bone. The scar remains, and that scar matters. Jung called this the integrity of the self, the idea that some experiences change us so profoundly, the only respectful response is to allow the change to stand, not to undo it, not to override it, but to say, this is who I am now. This is what I know, and I will act accordingly. And this brings us to one of the most emotionally layered parts of the journey, the ongoing grief of disillusionment. Even after the closure has brought clarity, even after life begins to bloom again, a part of you may still ache not for the person, but for the possibility that never came to life. You mourn the version of the relationship you were trying to build. You grieve the self who kept showing up year after year, believing that love, explanation, and patience would be enough. Jung described this as mourning not just a person, but a dream. And sometimes the dream is harder to release than the relationship itself. That's because empaths often fall in love with potential, with what could be, if only. But when the heart closes, the psyche is finally able to say, that version never existed. I was loving a ghost. This kind of grief is uniquely disorienting, because often nothing looks different on the outside. You may still be in contact with the person. You may still smile, still exchange words, still maintain social appearances. But internally, you know it's over. And when people ask, why are you so distant? You struggle to answer. Because how do you explain a closure they never saw? A death of feeling that happened in silence. Jung called this the loneliness of unseen grief. He wrote that one of the most painful aspects of this process is that it often goes unacknowledged. Because others didn't witness your heartbreak, they don't understand your healing. They urge you to reconnect, to forgive, to try again, not realizing that the decision wasn't made by your ego, but by something deeper. And so you carry your grief quietly, alone. But here's where Jung offered a radical reframing. He said that this grief isn't a sign that something went wrong, it's a sign that something went right. It means you honored your own limit, that you loved deeply, fully, and when it became dangerous to your soul, you let go. Not with hatred, not with drama, but with the quiet power of someone who understands their worth. He urged his patients to ritualize this grief, to name it, to give it space, not to rush past it or minimize it, but to recognize its importance. Because mourning the end of an open heart isn't weakness, it's reverence. It means you understood how much that openness mattered. And eventually the grief softens. It doesn't disappear entirely, but it transforms. From sharp sorrow to gentle wisdom. From loss to insight. And one day, without realizing it, you find yourself laughing again, creating again, trusting again. Not in the old way, not blindly, but from a place of strength. From a heart that has closed where it needed to and remains open where it's safe to. As this transformation deepens, something else emerges, something Jung considered central to the individuation process, a profound sense of self-trust. When your heart closes at the point of no return and you honor that closure, you begin to realize you can rely on your own psyche. That your inner world doesn't just break, it protects. It doesn't just hurt, it heals. The self, as Jung defined it, isn't simply a mystical concept. It's a living intelligence within you, one that knows when to give and when to stop giving. This shift brings with it a new kind of clarity in future relationships. You begin to see earlier when a dynamic is one-sided. You notice the red flags you used to explain away. You feel the early tugs of self-abandonment, and you pause. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. You've learned what your energy is worth, and you no longer spend it recklessly. Jung believed this stage was essential for every empath who wishes to live a whole, balanced life. The empath who never learns to close their heart is like an open window in a storm, exposed, unprotected, slowly eroded by forces they cannot control. But the empath who knows when to close the window, when to draw the boundary, when to say, enough, that empath is not only protected, but empowered. This is where love transforms into something sustainable, something with structure. Empathy is no longer a flood. It becomes a river. It flows, but it has banks. It nourishes, but it doesn't drown. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to recognize others like you, people who've also crossed their own thresholds, people who no longer need rescuing, but who can meet you in the space of mutual respect. Jung believed that when we cross the point of no return and integrate its lessons, we begin to attract and recognize healthier connections. Not because the world changes, but because we do. To those around you, your shift may still be misunderstood. Some will call you colder, less available, more distant. But those who truly see you will understand. They'll notice the way your energy has changed, how grounded it is, how peaceful, how potent. Because when the heart closes where it must, it doesn't become stone. It becomes sacred, selective, strong. And as Jung taught, what closes in one direction often opens in another. The energy you once spent trying to survive a toxic bond becomes available for thriving in creativity, in intimacy, in the quiet joy of simply being yourself. If you've crossed your own point of no return, know this: you are not broken. You are not heartless. You are not failing at love. You are mastering it. You've honored the wisdom of your own psyche, and that is an act of profound self-respect. Let the closure stand. Let the healing unfold. And as you move forward, carry this truth with you. Your heart didn't close because you stopped loving. It closed because it finally started loving you. If this resonated, like, share, or subscribe to our channel. Someone else may need this truth today too.